First of all, I'd like to say thank you so much for a very, very warm welcome. Thank you, the Dean, and particularly Santanu, wherever he is, can't see him. Thank you. To the Asansol Heritage Research Group, and also to all of you. That was wonderful singing. I recognise the tunes, I recognise some of the words, and the dancing also. It's a real privilege to be welcomed here with flowers, with a shawl, with your contributions, your creative contributions. So thank you very, very much indeed. I'm really delighted to be back. It's an honour to be back. As you've heard, my talk today is called Books Build Bridges, and it's about George Turnbull and William Hastie, two Scotsmen in Bengal. If you can't hear, please shout. And I should say that this is not a finished research project, so the images are very rough. They're from my phone, taken in a library, but I hope they'll give you a taste of what Turnbull's notebooks look like, and we are going to try and get digital copies to you from Cambridge. Turnbull, as you probably know, brought the railway to Asansol in 1855, and of course he recorded many existing bridges along the way, both broken and still in use. William Hastie was a linguist, a teacher, and a minister of the Church of Scotland, who became principal of the Scottish Church College in Kolkata in 1878. The books which build these bridges between Scotland and India today, for me, are Turnbull's notebooks and the books which Hastie brought back from Calcutta and gave to the Miners' Library at Wanlockhead, the village where he was born, about 40 miles south of Glasgow. How do I change? Do I do it or do you want to? Okay, next. Can I just tap? Is that okay? Yeah, that's fine. Lovely. These are the notebooks, some of the notebooks from Cambridge, the Centre for South Asian Studies, and they cover Turnbull's years in India from 1850 to 1863, when he was chief engineer for the East India Railway Company and built that first long-distance railway line from Howrah, 540 miles, to Asansol, and 61 miles more of branch lines. Turnbull had trained under the great engineer and bridge builder Thomas Telford, and Telford never forgot the self-help and knowledge that he had gained from the Miners' Library at Westerkirk in Scotland, near Dumfries, where Telford grew up. When he died, Telford left a large sum of money in his will to Westerkirk Library, a miners' library like the Wanlockhead one you'll see, and this was specifically for the purchase of books. It was about £1,000 in 1830, so it's a huge sum of money. And as you'll see from the slides, those books, the Telford bequest, which he gave to the library, are still on the library shelves today. There are 3 of these 18th century minor subscription libraries in Scotland. They're unique in the world because they were established by the miners themselves, not by the mine manager, not by the lord of the manor, by the miners themselves. Why? For self-improvement, for knowledge, for education, for the chance to leave the mining community, to get their sons out of going down the mine and being, in this case, lead miners. All of these are lead mining libraries. The first one, top left, is at Lead Hills, 2 miles from Wanlockhead, founded in 1741, still open, still being used. Wanlockhead, where I'm a trustee of the museum, is top right. That was founded in 1756, and Westerkirk was a bit later. That had a purpose-built building for it. That was set up in 1793. So in these remote mining villages, books and libraries provided education for the adults as well as for the children. You'll be interested to hear that Dorothy Wordsworth, that's the sister of the poet William Wordsworth, was travelling with her brother on a visit to Scotland in 1803. And she came to Wanlockhead and found the children, who were not allowed to work in the mine until they were over 8. So these children are under 8, washing the lead ore in the stream. She asked the children whether they went to school, Yes, they said. And what do you learn at school? Mathematics, Greek, and Latin, she said. So these 8-year-old children in a remote mining village are well educated, and their fathers would have access to the library. Thank you. This is the library at Wanlockhead as you see it today. It was founded by subscription by the miners, and a subscription per year. You can see the subscription ticket on the right. That would have been the equivalent of a couple of months' wages for a lead miner. Books were valuable, books were precious, they cost a lot of money. And so when the books were returned to the library, they were examined, and if they were dirty or damaged, you were fined. Were books stolen? No, books were not stolen or lost because they were valuable, and if you lost a book or stole a book, your reputation suffered. You would be untrustworthy, you wouldn't be given a job, and you'd find it very difficult to exist in the local community. Thank you. Next one. Right. This is Wanlockhead village itself. It's a little village, the highest village in Scotland actually, 1,400 feet up in the Lowther Hills. It used to have a shop, a garage, a school, 3 churches, and a pub. It now has none of those except the pub. There are 2 cemeteries, and the church, which you see in the middle, is a private residence. The windows of the church, you'll see in those at the east end there, are actually dedicated to Hastie's parents, and they were put up in the church, when it was a church, by one of Hastie's brothers. So Hastie lives on in Wanlockhead, even though the church is now no longer operating. You can see the hills round about. Not all of those are actual hills. Some of them will be the lead mining spoils, the tips, like coal tips, which built up round and about. And bottom left, you see the churchyard. And in the background, if you see in the left, you can see one of those spoil heaps and the smelting works, which are now in ruins on the right of the screen. How did I come to Wanlockhead? Well, partly a community project through the National Galleries, but also via Ed Hollis, whom I'm sure you all know, because Ed knew Wanlockhead, he'd been there, and when we went there again, he said, this is a community on the edge. It's a community where the whole purpose of the community, mining lead, has finished. The lead mines are in ruins, the church is gone, the school is gone, and it's now a heritage landscape. The lead mines closed there in 1856. So what is the link with Asansol? Well, there, Ed said, the community is on the edge because there's too much mining. It's destroying the heritage. It's destroying the landscape, it's destroying the history, and that's why the Asansol Heritage Group was in fact set up. And I'd like to suggest, as your dean has very wisely also suggested, that it's literature, libraries and books which are a catalyst, which bring these apparently very different places together. My first clue about linking Wanlockhead to this part of the world, to Bengal, or at least to India, came at Meadowfoot Cemetery in Wanlockhead with a tombstone, the one you see just in the front there. Because that tombstone is of William James Moffat, who was a mason in Wanlockhead, but it also commemorates his son William, who died at Madras in 1859. So this is somebody who got away from Wanlockhead, got right away from Wanlockhead. And in fact, these churchyards are really libraries of stone. They have the names, they have the occupations, they have the dates. And so they're very relevant in the studies of any historic area or city. Even if we don't know the name of the person who died, we know from the tombstone you see here, which says in Latin, memento mori, remember this dead man. We don't know his name, but from the style of the design, we know he must have died round about 1700. a few years before, I hope you can see these slides. Can you? They're a bit thin because it's rather light in here, but a few years before William Moffat died at Madras in 1859, George Turnbull arrived in Calcutta as chief engineer for the Eastern Railway. He was born in Perthshire, not Wanlockhead, and it was Ed Hollis who introduced me to Turnbull, and the fact that he built the railway here to Asansol, arriving in 1855, just 175 years ago this year. So Books and Bridges is going to focus mainly on Turnbull's notebooks, and you see one of them here, which also gives his address in Calcutta, 5 Russell Street, as well as one of the places he saw on his journey out. This is part of the citadel at the island of Malta in the Mediterranean on his journey out. This is another notebook, and here we have Turnbull recording Howrah as his address, which of course, as you all know, is the great bridge over the river at Calcutta. I looked at 4 or 5 of Turnbull's notebooks, not all of them in Cambridge. There are 3 pocket notebooks, which you've seen, which contain drawings, blank pages, small pocket-sized notebooks, which contain drawings. And the others are printed books, sort of journals or which have almanacs in the front and lots of information. And he kept these as a journal, as a diary, but they have no drawings. You'll see that 1854 and 1856, there's no 1855. There is a note which says, given to Mr. Haynes to use as evidence of the wedding in Neuchâtel in Switzerland in 1855. This was because Turnbull's first wife had died only 4 months after she arrived in Calcutta. And Turnbull later, in 1855, married again, but he was marrying his first wife's half-sister. And in England that would have been probably illegal because of the close blood relationship. But it wasn't illegal in Switzerland, so the pair got married in Switzerland. And unfortunately, the very book that would be wonderful to read now, 1855, the year the railway came to Asansol, is missing. So that's a really unfortunate. So Turnbull, whatever his family life, Turnbull's main focus, as you know, and his responsibility was to get the railway built in India. And of course, that meant bridging many rivers and taking careful note of existing bridges, whether they were still in use, whether they were ruined, whether they were large, whether they were small. And this bridge, this diagram, Turnbull labels Ganji Nadi. It's from December 1852. And it's one of the few drawings that actually mentions the word rail. I hope you can see in the bottom diagram the reference he makes to a rail. I'm going to show you a number of these drawings because it was important for Turnbull that he also appreciated the geology of the area he was moving through. He notices some of the banks of the river are strong red clay, which means the river doesn't seep out. That's a strong foundation. He notices where some of the rivers flood or don't flood. He notices where there is stone above the coal because he's going to need the building stone. And on one of these diagrams, not the next one. I just want to say that the Chunar one, yeah. And Chunar also, just a little note, this one, leave that one here, thank you. Maybe I should come around here. He says, camped in the old Mohammedan burial ground. So occasionally you get just a little bit of personal information about how he's travelling. Thank you. Here you see here that does not seem to be flooded on the left-hand side. And also the little diagram bottom right is interesting because it says near to the old chain bridge. I don't know where this is, but maybe one day you'll be able to tell me where there was a chain bridge in that area. I also show a little decorative drawing. There are very few decorative drawings in these notebooks. It's business, business, business. Railway bridges, piers, crossings, the sides of the river. But here there's a rather nice little drawing of a little niche. And I'm grateful to Dr. Santanu for helping to identify this. So there's a lot of work to do on the places that these bridges are found, whether they're still standing or not. Partly it's difficult for me because Turnbull's writing is not always very clear, and also I'm not familiar with the 19th century spellings of some of your places. So there's a lot of work, as I said, to be done there. Here Turnbull just records a bridge with holes in the spandrels. He gives it a date, or you can find out the date that this was drawn. And I thought I'd just say something here about Turnbull's travels, because obviously he's travelling a lot of countryside from Howrah to Asansol. And on one occasion, he relates in 1851 how he and two other engineers were travelling in 3 palkis with their 36 coolies, and they covered 25 miles in 7 hours. It's a remarkable feat, Turnbull writes. He also notes that the staff, the people that he used who worked with him, carried these puppies, if you treated them with respect, if you paid them a decent wage, if you fed them, they achieved remarkable journeys in very short time. He also notes, though, that on one occasion he had to travel for 50 hours just to spend 3 hours in examining and recording the bank of the River Soane. So it was hard work, this survey work, long before he even got the bridge built. As you might have noticed, measurements were a crucial part of Turnbull's work. How many rails are you going to need to cover the distance between Howrah and Calcutta? How wide should the track be? How many sleepers do you need? How wide does the sleeper need to be? How much distance between one sleeper and another? The measurements were incredible. And in Turnbull's notebooks, you see his own conversion table here for what he calls Bengal square measures. And he relates feet to, I hope I've got the pronunciation right, a kata, a bigger, and a katak. This is February 1850. It's also not only bridges that he measures. Occasionally it's something that isn't a bridge, and here you see his drawing of a dak bungalow, which he says is on the Ganges between Mongir and Patna. He'd arrived in Patna at 5:30 in the morning, again an indication of how hard he's working. And he also made a diagram of the great granary at Patna and copied its inscription. This is a particularly impressive double page, over 2 pages of the notebook, of measurements of a bridge. He calls it, I think I'm correct in saying, the Fata Bridge over the river Poon Poon. Would that make sense? December 1852. And his notebooks also record crossing one of the rivers by a bridge of boats. 50 boats, he said, in this bridge of boats. I can't find out where that was, but it would be very interesting to see if you could identify where that bridge of boats was. But the measurements you see on these drawings are incredible. Every arch, every pier, the height of the arch above the water, the width of the bridge, the width of the walls of the bridge, whether the walls are damaged. And here is, just to take a little break from bridges, this is one of the few drawings that I mentioned that are not a bridge. This is the Alamgiri Mosque in Benares. And of course, Turnbull includes a few measurements, but you'll see in the bottom corner that he also notes measures taken with a handkerchief, i.e. he didn't have a tape measure, so he used his handkerchief to make the measurements, but he also adds that he checked it afterwards with a proper tape measure. He was very precise about his information. In April 1853, Turnbull reached Punabad at 6 o'clock in the morning, and he records that he saw there, quote, 11 terrors lifting 110 gallons of water per minute. Here you see an alternative from one of his drawings using oxen to draw water. And this reminded me of mining at Wanlockhead, where water was a constant problem. It rains a lot there, and of course water always finds somewhere to run to, and there are plenty of shafts, mine shafts, for the water to pour into off the hills at Wanlockhead. So water was a a great problem. And in the 16th century, the miners invented a method of using water to power the buckets and the ropes that would lift the water from the bottom of these shafts. So it was water, not an animal, that powered the wheels and ropes. And basically, when the rope and the bucket went down to the bottom of the shaft, the rope mechanism sent the water not up to the surface, but along another excavated channel and back into the stream. So you've got a complete circular motion of water taking water out of the mine. The beam engine that you see here at Wanlockhead works on much the same principle. Once the weight of the water in one side reaches a maximum height, the bucket on the other side sinks right down to the bottom of the mine. And as it fills up, the first bucket obviously drops down and sends the water into a sluice. And this is a unique survivor of this way of this bucket mechanism working. And it was built in 1839, and it's actually a listed monument at Wanlockhead. Sometimes Turnbull refers back to his native Scotland. In December 1850, he records that it was the shortest day of the year, and he was riding along the banks of the Barracker River and back along the Grand Trunk Road. And he wrote, quote, "The countryside is very different from what I expected. Elevated tablelands, scenery like that of Dunkeld." You see a picture of Dunkeld here, and I suspect that Dunkeld in Perthshire, not very far from where Turnbull was born, has a bridge built by Telford. And as I mentioned, Telford had worked in England with Telford. He also refers to the Trossachs, which are part of Perthshire where you find Loch Lomond, which you might have heard of, and other references also to Dunkeld. As I mentioned before, measurements were critical. Turnbull needed to know how far it was between one town and another, one village and another, to be able to calculate the total length and number and weight. Remember, he's building bridges, the weight of the rails required. And this table gives Runnygunge as 121 3/4 miles from Howrah. There are also calculations for how many rails weigh how many tons, and therefore how many tons will be needed to cover a certain distance. And no, I just need that. And if you see on the right-hand side, there is a reference to a Mr. Buddle who was at Runnygunge, and a reference also to how many rails were already lying at Runnygunge. So you have to look for them, but there are references to people at their posts helping to build this railway, and that help build real history, the history of real people and their stories as they help build this huge, great railway. Another note about Runnygunge Colliery is that there was no coking coal there, but Turnbull does note that there was a 9-foot thick coal seam and good stone above the coal. He also notes that the coal was sold for 1 anna a mund, is that how you pronounce it? But retailed in Calcutta for 6 annas a mund. So look how much profit you're making between Asansol and selling it in Calcutta, 1 anna and 6 annas. The list of engineers, which you see, gives Mr. Purser at Runnygunge, and these lists include not only those who are serving at the date that Turnbull made the lists, but also previous servants of the East India Railway Company, serving at whichever station he's mentioning, and also, which is interesting, those who died. So you have a sort of history of these engineers working at Runnygunge and other places along the line from Howrah. This is a page from one of the printed diaries. We don't have drawings in the printed diaries, but we have quite a lot of written inscription. And this one is a reference to Turnbull riding 11 miles to Rajmahal and asking information from the deputy collector of Buglepore. He also notes, near the bottom of the page, that there is no objection to making a station in the ruins of the old palace there. So occasionally you have the Mohammedan graveyard, you have the palace ruins. There was also the problem of the British government not wanting Turnbull to cut through jungle areas, to cut through forests. This was people's livelihood, it was their wood. Turnbull needed to cut to make his railway a straight line as possible, not too many curves. And he waited so long for any decision from the British government that in the end he decided to cut through a small area of forest with discussion with the local people, and he then paid them a compensation for the wood and the land that he was taking over. It's interesting to note that before the railways were built in Scotland, to go from Wanlockhead to the port, to Edinburgh's port, which is Leith, which is about 50 miles, a horse and cart could only carry 6 ingots of lead at a time. An ingot of lead is a lead bar. And that took 2 days. You can imagine the difference that the railways would make either in Bengal or in Wanlockhead in Scotland when you could take these heavy weights by rail instead of by horse and carriage. Sorry, could I go back to that? I'm very sorry. I forgot to explain that the slides you see on the right are of the Wanlockhead and Lead Hills Railway. It closed in the 1950s, but it's now run by volunteers as a heritage railway. It doesn't even go all the way to Wanlockhead because there's some land dispute and they wouldn't allow the old railway line to be opened up over a farmer's land. So the railway runs from between Lead Hills and the station at Glengonna. But you can see it's a heritage train. It's only open on weekends in the summer. But it gives you some idea of the track between Wanlockhead and Lead Hills, which would have gone all the way to the coast and Edinburgh. The notebooks, as I've said, contain very little personal information. So I show you this page, which actually is recording Turnbull in London, in address at Kensington, 26 Palace Gardens Terrace, and he actually notes 4 of his children, Ellen, Jamie and Rose, buried in the circular cemetery in Calcutta, they didn't die, and George. There were actually sons born after this diary record was made. Alexander was born in London in 1863, and Katie was born in London in 1864. And on the other page, you see, written in India, of course, some of Turnbull's staff. So he does list not only his British colleagues, his engineers, but also the names of the staff who worked for him, and he also lists in certain pages their wages and how much he paid them. Another page has a number of reminders to call in at Jessop's to discuss steel girders, to collect his watch from Murray's, and also, sadly, to speak to Llewellyn about my poor Jean's monument. You remember his wife died very soon after she arrived in Calcutta, and this is a memo to himself to go and meet Mr. Llewellyn to talk about a monument to her. There's also a fascinating reference to sending a picture back to 21 Union Street, Edinburgh. I think this is the only reference I've got to Turnbull sending a letter home. There are occasional references to him receiving letters from home. And I think 21 Union Street, Edinburgh, which still stands, was the home of a sister or aunt. Just leave that for a moment. Yeah, sorry. There are references, as I mentioned, to Edinburgh in Turnbull's notes. And on the 26th of December, so that's the day after Christmas Day in 1852, he's writing from Benares. And he says Benares has narrow streets like Edinburgh, only cleaner. No horses or carriages can travel in these narrow paths. And I show you here one of the narrow streets on the main off the main street in the old city of Edinburgh, and you'll see how narrow they are. The interesting point for me was that Turnbull said that Benares was cleaner than Edinburgh in 1850. I was quite surprised to read that. Sorry. One wonders how often Turnbull did think of Scotland. And here there are references to Edinburgh, as I've mentioned, and also to Christmas Day, I've mentioned quite often. He didn't seem to take any break on Christmas Day, and you'll see that there's a little diagram here. On Christmas Day, he was working, and make a note of Mr. Evans' tent and its cost and size. There was a moment, however, in 1853 when he was forced to slow down because, as his diary records, 3 fingers of his right hand were badly damaged when an iron chair collapsed on them. And obviously the writings for the next few days in his diary are a matter of words only. It seems to have been quite sort of straightforward from now on. Not too much opposition, problem with cutting down the trees, but there was opposition. And this is an interesting page because it records that the names of the people who actually opposed the railways. This was November 1850, so quite early on. Babu Ganga Pasal, pardon my pronunciation, and Gopi Kishji Pasal. And they opposed the railway and made it quite difficult for Turnbull to get permission to go ahead. I think this was a land issue and a question of how much reparation was going to be paid to these 2 gentlemen for the land that they were going to lose when the railway went through it. The railway, of course, did continue, and you'll see a newspaper cutting from one of the front covers of one of Turnbull's diaries that records not only that the opium crop had failed in Bengal, but the last centre supports were successfully removed yesterday from the great railway bridge over the River Soane. So this is Turnbull's railway is getting newspaper coverage as he completes various stages of it. Turnbull mentions that he admired Kitto's fine bridge at Mirzapur with its 3 Gothic arches, and he notes that it apparently cost 60,000 rupees. 60,000 rupees in the 1850s is quite a lot of money. The interesting point is, in that entry, which I haven't shown you, is that Turnbull says that the stone of that bridge was much like the stone of Craigleith. That's the stone quarry which much of Edinburgh buildings was built from. So again, another reference back to Edinburgh. Instead of the Mirzapur Bridge, I show a Turnbull drawing of another building by Kitto of the new college at Benares. It was at Benares that Turnbull witnessed and recorded an eclipse on the 26th of December 1856. A lot of these entries seem to be round about Christmas Day, 25th of December. The eclipse began, he says, at 05:55. By 6:20, he records a sort of burnt sienna colour over everything, and the eclipse was over by 8:20. Turnbull adds, as you see, that the time was by my watch, presumably the watch that you heard he collected from Mr. Murray, which we heard about a bit earlier. And of course, meticulous as ever, he also notes that the measurements with his watch, would be corrected as soon as possible so that he got the exact timings. Interestingly, he also notes that there were many visitors to Benares that day, the day of the eclipse, bathing in the Ganges, and in the evening, many lamps floating on the water. And I just thought, with all the reference to the Mahakumbh now, that was an ironic reference. There are 3 pages of Turnbull's record of the eclipse. This is the middle one, between 7 and 8. And the eclipse takes us back to Wanlockhead and the library there. Books, Building Bridges Again. This is the title page from a book by Mr. Reverend Hall called Outlines of Astronomy, and it's written for families and schools. It even includes practical experiments. Take a bit of card, make a bit of string, take a twig, so that children actually can work out what eclipses or patterns of the stars are for themselves. It was published in the 1840s. Here's a bridge which has already been mentioned, the bridge from Wanlockhead to India. And this is the Scottish Church College, where, as we've heard, William Hastie became the principal in 1878. Hastie's lecture lectures as principal at that college included one on Wordsworth's poem, The Excursion. Wordsworth, you remember Dorothy Wordsworth's visit to Wanlockhead with her brother in 1803. And Hastie, unusually, while he was teaching this poem, The Excursion, advised his students to go and experience the phenomenon of trance for themselves. That was quite unusual for a Scottish minister of Church of Scotland to advise that. One of those students was Lal Bahari Dey, whom you know very well as author and collector of many Bengali songs and stories. Lal Bahari is buried in the Scottish Cemetery in Calcutta, of which I'm also a trustee. And we have on our Calcutta Scottish Heritage Board Madrula Chakraborty, who is founder member of the Bengali Cultural Association, and Professor Bashabi Fraser, poet herself, and director of the Scottish Centre of Tagore Studies at Edinburgh University. So more books and bridges being built there. Thank you. There are 27 books in Wanlockhead Miners' Library which relate specifically to India in their titles and main content. 8 of these books were presented by William Hastie, and they include 2 books about Lal Bahari Dey. And you'll see that all the books in the library have this special bookplate with the miner's tools, the number of the book and its location, and very often who gave the books, which is how we know about the ones Hastie gave. He gave one of the first copies of the Quran translated into English. This English translation was published in 1887, and Hastie gave a copy to Wanlockhead Library in 1888. So it's a very new edition that he gave. Hastie was a good linguist, especially in German, and he published a number of translations after his return to Scotland, including one of Novalis' Hymns and Thoughts on Religion. Hastie's style is not what we would normally use today, and I thought I'd read you, because you probably can't see it on the screen, his translator's preface to Novalis' book. He writes, "Stirred by a sympathy which has been freshened by recent study and moved by a certain pathos in his relations, the translator threw off the following English rendering, using the occasional hours of restful quiet during the last Christmastide." Interestingly, if you read further on in that introduction, Hastie also records that the author, Novalis, was due to take up an appointment as a mine supervisor, but unfortunately, perhaps fortunately for us, his health prevented this. But it was really interesting to find that mine reference in the middle of a book on hymns and thoughts on religion. Another of Hastie's donations to Wanlockhead is this book, and I'm sorry I haven't got the author and title of it, but I chose it because it's got this very interesting engraving of the Girnar rock and the rock inscription. So presumably Hastie was interested enough to share this publication with the Miners' Library in Wanlockhead. Another donation is Captain Skinner's Excursions in India, 2 volumes published in 1833. I chose the second volume. The first volume, frontispiece, shows the sacrifice of a goat, but this one, if you can see it, shows women also on this excursion. And I think 1833, to have these women travelling in quite remote parts of India with an engraving is quite interesting. I showed as one of Hastie's first donations the frontispiece from a book called Dramatic Pictures, which is actually a book of poems and traditions. And one of the poems is about Bishop Leighton's library. That still survives at Dunblane, not that far from Wanlockhead, and it was collected by Bishop Leighton, who was the minister at Dunblane from 1662 until he moved to Glasgow. He was promoted to Glasgow in 1680. So this library is collected between 1662 and 1680, not long after the period of Shah Jahan. I mean, if you think of what's happening across the world at that time. So this is a very early library, but it's not like the minor subscription library because it's the bishop's personal library, not accessible to general readers. I couldn't really talk about this without talking about Dwarkanath Tagore. I mentioned Tagore's study centre in Edinburgh, and you will all know that Tagore, the poet Tagore's grandfather, Dwarkanath, was a very successful entrepreneur, including coal mining at Rannigunge. The Asansol Heritage Research Group has succeeded in getting the ruins of Dwarkanath's house listed. That bumpy picture of undergrowth is actually undergrowth covering what remains of Dwarkanath's house. And as you'll see from that photo, this piece of history is in real danger of being lost forever. There's a great big tip behind the house, and if that tip gets loosened in the monsoon, all the stones will just come tearing down in front of the house. In fact, there's a very contemporary link with the Tagore family through a friend of mine who is the co-organiser of the Jaipur Literary Festival. You'll see how these bridges jump over the centuries. Sanjoy Roy is, as I say, co-organiser of the Jaipur Literary Festival, a frequent visitor to Edinburgh because he runs something called Teamwork, which is a cultural body. And when I mentioned Wanlockhead and Rannigunge, Sanjoy said, "Oh, my great-great-uncle was one of the people who helped Dwarkanath Tagore when he had cash flow problems." I didn't know this. I've known Sanjoy for 20, 30 years. "So come and speak at the Jaipur Literary Festival this year," he said. "Come and tell us about Asansol heritage, about the mining, about Wanlockhead." "I'm sorry, Sanjoy," I said, "I'm booked already. Asansol's my priority. But maybe next year we could all get on the stage at the Jaipur Literary Festival, which would be really exciting." I'd like to close with one old bridge and one new one. Here at Wanlockhead, among the Library of Gravestones, remember that Library of Gravestones term I used, is the tomb of William Hastie, who died in 1903, and his sister is also buried with him. She died in 1947. If you look carefully, I hope you can see to the left of Hastie's monument that mound of mining spoil, which is still there in the countryside. The other slide I included because it shows this library of stone, these gravestones stretching away towards one of the little miners' cottages in the village. And actually, you can, if you know which one to look, it does show that Madras gravestone, the one to Reverend Moffat, who died off Madras, which I illustrated at the beginning of the talk. And for the new bridges, I'd like to mention the digitisation projects the Asansol Heritage Research Group have been involved with, because already they have managed to digitise the births, marriages and deaths records, another book, another bridge, at Rannigunge Wesleyan Methodist Church. And I was delighted to meet the minister. He came and met us in Asansol last night. This is a project that's been organised and funded in collaboration with the British Association for Cemeteries of South Asia, so another bridge to the UK. Two other Kazi Nazrul digitisation projects have been funded by the British Library, so there's a link between Asansol and London. And the Lodge Pioneer at Asansol are also keen to digitise their records. I hope you can see, top right, this is the banner at the Lodge Pioneer in Asansol. As you probably know, it shows a railway train, which is a reminder of Turnbull, George Turnbull, busy as ever, and this is one of his notebooks which says, "Started another notebook." So many notes that he'd run out of space in his other one. A splendid edition of Lal Bahari Day's works is the bridge from William Hastie to Edinburgh and Asansol. As I mentioned, Lal Bahari Day was one of William Hastie's students, and Head Follis found this wonderful edition of Lal Bahari Day in Edinburgh and presented it to Setubandha Museum. And finally, I would like to mention Setubandha pardon my pronunciation, the museum itself, because as you know, that word from Sanskrit means bridge. I'm immensely grateful for all that Dr. Banerjee, Hemanta Subhajit and the Asansol Heritage Group have arranged for my visit to Asansol, and I hope there will be many more bridges between Setubandha and the Museum of Lead Mining at Wanlockhead and between Scotland and Bengal.